There are moments in human history when the world seems to hold its breath, when empires rise from the dust and reshape the fate of civilizations. One such moment began in the scorched valleys and golden plains of ancient Persia. From the center of a rugged land came a vision of unity, tolerance, and empire. It began with a man named Cyrus, a prince of humble birth who wanted to dream beyond the limits of his time in a world of iron and blood, where kings ruled through terror and empires burned as quickly as they were born. Cyrus would build something different, a realm bound not only by the sword, but by the idea of justice under his hand. Scattered tribes became an army. Kingdoms that had warred for centuries fell one after another until the world bowed before the Achaemenid Empire, the first great superpower of the ancient world. From the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Central Asia, Persia's reach knew no equal. And yet, like all empires, its greatness carried the seed of its own undoing. Cyrus's heirs would expand the empire to its very peak, building roads that stitched continents together and palaces that touched the sky. But power is a double-edged blade. The same ambition that built an empire of gold would one day lead to fire and ruin. This is the story of kings and conquerors, of vision and vengeance, of an empire that wanted to rule not only the lands beneath the sun, but the very hearts of men. This is the story of the Persian Empire. The dawn of Persia. In the origin of what we now call Iran, long before the empires of marble and gold, there were only valleys of wind, stone, and silence. Yet even in that silence, life had already begun to take root. Thousands of years before history was written, people lived and thrived in these valleys, the first signs of what would one day become ancient Persia. Around 7,200 BC, when the snow began to melt from the Zagros Mountains, small farming communities started to appear in this tough, rocky land. Two of these early villages were Choga Golan and Choga Bonut, which are still known through history. Here, people learned to shape the wild earth, planting crops and building the first signs of settled life among the narrow valleys and rocky terraces. The first fields of barley and lentils swayed beneath the wind. Archaeologists have found traces of wild legumes, grains, and even the earliest known jar of wine, sealed more than 7,000 years ago, now resting in the University of Pennsylvania, a silent witness to humankind's first celebration of civilization. This land was not yet Persia, nor a kingdom, nor even a name on a map, but already its spirit of endurance was being shaped by the mountains themselves. The Zagros formed a natural wall, dividing the highlands of Iran from the low, fertile plains of Mesopotamia, in what is now Iraq. Across that invisible border, the first true cities of the world were rising. Among them was the Sumerian jewel, Uruk, glowing like a star above the desert sands. From Uruk's eastward reach, there was an expansion that would soon create a city destined to become legendary. Susa, founded around 4,395 BC, perhaps even earlier. Susa would one day become the heart of Elam, the first clearly defined nation-state of this region, and unknowingly, the first foreshadowing of Persia itself. For 5.5 millennia, Susa endured. Through floods, fires, and wars, its markets stayed busy with trade, its walls bearing the laughter and cries of countless generations. It was not until the thunder of the Mongols, thousands of years later, that its ancient heartbeat finally fell silent. But at the beginning, Elam was not an empire in the modern sense. It was more a coalition of tribes and peoples scattered among valleys and ridges, bound by custom and survival rather than decree. The word Elam itself was not theirs. It was given to them by the Mesopotamians, who looked eastward and called them the people of the mountains. In their own tongue, they may have said something closer to Halamt, meaning those of the high country. That title, people of the high country, would become more than geography. It would become an identity. Through all of Persia's later empires, this defining tension between mountain and plain, between endurance and abundance, would shape the fate of nations. For millennia, the mountain people and the plain people clashed in endless cycles of conquest and revenge. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, as brutal and tragic as it was just the most recent chapter in a struggle that had lasted for 6,000 years. A fight between the rich, fertile plains and the harsh, unforgiving mountains. Life in those mountains, where Elam once stood, was never easy. The rugged terrain could not support the great irrigation networks that made Mesopotamia flourish. Instead, Elam's people turned to semi-nomadic herding and small-scale valley farming. They were fewer in number, but tougher and forged by the landscape itself. The Mesopotamians saw them as rough and barbaric, but the Elamites saw themselves as resilient and free. Their enemies farmed the plains as the Elamites conquered the mountains. Much about the Elamites remains a mystery. Their language, which first appeared around 3200 BC, has long resisted the efforts of scholars to fully understand it. It stands apart from all other tongues of the ancient world. Neither Semitic like Akkadian nor Indo-European like the later Persian speech. Their art and beliefs reveal a people deeply bound to nature, unlike the Sumerians or Egyptians who often sculpted divine kings and hybrid gods. The Elamites filled their temples and shrines with images of animals like bulls, dogs, and creatures of the mountain wilds. Their worship was directed toward a mother goddess, symbol of fertility and creation, whose presence was felt in sacred groves and upon high cliffs rather than within stone temples. It was a religion of tolerance, one that absorbed rather than erased the gods of others. Over time, as the Elamites interacted with their neighbors, they welcomed foreign deities into their pantheon, a generosity of faith that would later echo in Zoroastrianism, Persia's great religion of light and fire. The Elamites also showed a rare respect for women. In their art, queens stand beside kings, equal in stature and power. This equality would later reappear in Persian culture, in the way noblewomen held authority and influence in court and society. But for all their artistry and strength, the Elamites lived under constant threat. The Sumerians, their powerful western neighbors, coveted their resources and trade routes around 2700 BC. Elam suffered one of the earliest recorded wars in history, invaded and looted by the armies of Sumer. Later, Sargon of Akkad, the legendary conqueror, brought Susa under his dominion. Yet Elam endured. By 1100 BC, Elam rose once more. King Shutruk-Nakhunte led numerous conquests, capturing the cities around Babylon and bringing back immense treasures, but his sons, divided by ambition, turned victory into weakness. Around 1120 BC, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon struck back, conquering Elam and proving once again that no power in this region could hold dominance for long. Still, even in defeat, Elam remained a bridge of worlds. Its markets were filled with goods from afar, including lapis from Afghanistan, tin from the east, stone and wood from the mountains, traded for the grains and textiles of Mesopotamia. Artifacts from as far as the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan have been found in Susa, showing how deeply connected this ancient land already was to the wider world. This trade would one day form part of the great arteries of civilization, the earliest outlines of what would become the Silk Road, with Persia at its heart. As centuries passed, the power of Elam waned from the northern steppes of Eurasia. New tribes began to move south. They were nomads, riders of massive grasslands, speaking languages that would one day form the roots of Persian, Median, and Parthian. Slowly, over 1,000 years, these newcomers mingled with the Elamites, especially in the southern plains. The two people fused their cultures into something new, the first seeds of Persian identity. Though the Elamite state was dying, its influence continued. Even after the Iranians took control, Elamite language and administration continued to serve as the bureaucratic backbone of the land. In the shadow of history, the Elamites had become the architects of the Persian world that was about to rise. And from that fusion, a new power began to show up. The Age of Migrations. The old kingdom of Elam had stood proud for millennia, a realm born of mountains and clay, where artisans carved their gods from stone and rulers governed beneath the shadows of sacred peaks, but nothing in history stands forever. By the dawn of the second millennium BC, the pulse of Elam began to weaken. The great city of Susa still carried the chants of its priests and the hammering of metal workers. But beyond its walls, new sounds began to emerge. The steady beat of hooves across the open plains, the quiet movement of nomads traveling south from the wide Eurasian steppes. Eventually, the Iranian tribes, the ancestors of the Medes, the Persians, and the Parthians, started moving in. They were wanderers of the wind, herders and horsemen from a land where the horizons stretched without end. These tribes, descendants of the Indo-Iranians, brought with them a new language, a new culture, and a fierce reverence for the open sky and the sacred fire. At first, their arrival was gradual. and Elamite farmers watched as these strangers drove their flocks across the mountain passes. Trade began, marriages followed, and over centuries the two worlds began to merge, shaping together the identity that would one day be called Persian. Soon enough, the Elamite language remained the tongue of administration and law long after the newcomers became dominant. Its elegant script marked tablets, contracts, and royal decrees, an evidence that this new Persia was being built atop the bones of an older civilization. But the world was shifting fast beyond the Zagros. In the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, the mighty Assyrian Empire was supreme. From Nineveh to Babylon, they ruled through fear, their armies cutting paths of fire and chains across the ancient Near East. In the highlands of Iran, the scattered tribes of the Medes and Persians watched this power with unease. They had seen what happened to those who stood in the Assyrians' way, and so quietly, they began to unite as survivors, seeking strength through solidarity. Among them rose the Medes, a confederation of clans who forged the first semblance of an Iranian empire. Their leader, Deioces, as later chronicled by Herodotus, became renowned for his wisdom and sense of justice. His rule, whether legend or truth, symbolized the first spark of organized kingship among the Iranians. A single hand guiding many tribes from their mountain strongholds, the Medes grew bolder. They struck alliances, forged armies, and built cities. And when the Assyrians grew weak from their own arrogance and endless wars, the Medes seized their moment under King Xerxes. They joined forces with the Babylonians, storming Nineveh in 612 BC, ending centuries of Assyrian dominance. For the first time, the people of the mountains had humbled the lords of the plains. Yet even this victory was but a prelude. For in the lands of Anshan, far to the south, another power was rising quietly, a new kingdom born from the union of Elamite legacy and Persian blood. There, a young prince was about to change the world forever. His name was Cyrus, known to history as Cyrus the Great. His story began in the kingdom of Anshan, a small but ambitious Persian state ruled by the Achaemenid dynasty, vassals to the mighty Medes. The Medes thought their hold over the Persians was absolute. But Cyrus saw what others did not, that the Medes had become complacent, their empire, built on conquest, had lost its purpose. Their vassals, weary of tribute and submission, yearned for freedom. In 553 BC, Cyrus made his move. He rebelled against his Median overlords. At first it seemed like madness, because the Medes had the larger army, the stronger fortresses, the older name, but fate favored the daring. When a Median general named Harpagus was sent to crush Cyrus's rebellion, something unexpected happened. Instead of fighting, Harpagus switched sides. Was it vengeance for a past insult by the Median king Astyages? Or perhaps admiration for Cyrus's vision? Whatever the reason, the alliance changed everything. Together, Cyrus and Harpagus marched on the Median capital of Ecbatana. By 550 BC, the impossible had happened. The Medes had fallen, and their empire was now the Persian Empire, the first of its kind. Cyrus, once a vassal, had become the master of the Iranian world, but he was just getting started. Over the next decade, Cyrus's ambitions stretched beyond the mountains of Iran. His armies swept west into Lydia, where the fabulously wealthy King Croesus ruled. Legend says that Croesus, confident in his power, asked the oracle of Delphi whether he should wage war against Persia. The oracle claimed he will destroy a great empire. Croesus took it as a sign of victory, but he was wrong. Cyrus's tactics and discipline shattered the Lydian forces. Sardis, the glittering Lydian capital, fell. Croesus was captured, but Cyrus spared his life, welcoming him as an advisor rather than an enemy. This was Cyrus's genius. He conquered through respect as much as through force. Then there was the campaign that would make him immortal, the conquest of Babylon in 539 BC. The world's most magnificent city fell without bloodshed. Cyrus's forces entered Babylon through a diverted riverbed of the Euphrates, bypassing the mighty walls that had stood for centuries. To the astonishment of its people, Cyrus did not destroy Babylon. Instead, he proclaimed freedom, allowing the exiled Israelites to return home and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. For this, the Hebrew Bible would call him God's anointed, the only foreign ruler ever given that title. From the valleys of the Indus to the shores of the Aegean, his empire stretched farther than any before him, yet his rule was built on justice. he created a sophisticated system of satrapies or provinces, each governed by a satrap answerable only to the king. A network of royal inspectors ensured honesty and order throughout the vast realm. Trade flourished along new roads. Messengers could travel from one end of the empire to the other in days, stopping at stations that offered food, water, and fresh horses. The old Elamite city of Susa became one of his royal capitals, a symbol that Persia's roots had not been forgotten. Cyrus's leadership reshaped the concept of empire itself as a mosaic of cultures under one law. He respected the gods of those he conquered, restoring their temples and honoring their traditions. In 530 BC, on the frontiers of his empire, Cyrus met his end in battle while leading from the front, as he always had. His tomb still stands in Pasargadae, a simple stone monument in the wind-swept plain, the resting place of a man who forged the world's first superpower, but from the seeds he planted would rise another giant, Darius the Great, and after him Xerxes, whose ambitions would stretch toward Greece itself. And though the Persian Empire would one day fall, its legacy of tolerance, innovation, and unity would remain across history. Darius, Xerxes, and the Empire of Fire. After the death of Cyrus the Great, the empire he forged passed to his son, but soon after came another titan, Darius Werned, known to history as Darius the Great, the man who would carry Persia's banner farther than any before him. Under Darius, the Persian Empire became more than a kingdom. It became a world system, stretching from the burning sands of Egypt to the icy valleys of Central Asia. His ambitions knew no horizon. His armies marched eastward to the edges of the Indus Valley, now known as Pakistan. But it was westward, toward Greece, that Darius's name would forever be held into legend. In 492 BC, Darius turned his gaze toward the scattered Greek city-states of small, defiant, and endlessly quarrelsome. To Persia, this campaign was a minor affair, a punishment expedition meant to remind the Greeks who ruled the world, but destiny often hides in small things. As the Persian fleet crossed the stormy Aegean, disaster struck. A sudden tempest rose, tearing through the sky, smashing ships against the cliffs and swallowing thousands of men beneath the waves. The invasion force dwindled. What was meant to be a show of imperial strength became a desperate struggle. 2 years later, in 490 BC, the Persians met the Greeks on the plain of Marathon. The battle was fierce and fast, bronze against bronze, dust and blood swirling under the blazing sun. Against all odds, the Greeks won. It was not the fall of an empire, but it was a blow to its pride. Darius, furious and humiliated, vowed revenge. He began planning a second, greater invasion, a storm of men and ships that would sweep Greece from the map. But fate intervened before he could strike. Darius died in 486 BC, leaving the unfulfilled vengeance to his son. Where Darius had been the builder and organizer, his son Xerxes I was the avenger, bold, impatient, and burning with inherited fury. In him, Persia's grandeur and hubris collided. When Xerxes launched his invasion in 480 BC, it was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. A tide of soldiers from every corner of the empire, Persians, Medes, Egyptians, Babylonians, and countless others. The campaign forced the eternally divided Greek cities to unite for survival. Xerxes crossed the Hellespont on bridges of boats and carved his way into Greece, setting fire to Athens. Its people already fled. The smoke of the burning Acropolis rose into the heavens like a signal to the gods, signaling that Persia had come. But pride would meet its reckoning at sea. At the Battle of Salamis, the Greeks, with smaller and swifter ships, struck the Persian navy within the narrow straits. Flames consumed the sea as triremes shattered and men screamed beneath the waves. Xerxes watched from a golden throne at the top a cliff as his fleet was annihilated before his eyes. Fear spread, and the great king, who was worried his retreat would be cut off, pulled back toward Asia. The remainder of his forces stayed behind, only to be crushed a year later at Plataea in 479 BC. It was the beginning of Persia's long, slow retreat from Greece, and the moment the Greeks began to believe that even the gods could bleed. Xerxes returned to his empire, haunted and diminished. Rebellions started, and in 465 BC, the king who had ruled half the known world was assassinated by his own commander of the royal guard. Thus ended the line of kings who had personally faced Greece. But Persia itself endured. Its roads still carries trade, and the empire remained a sleeping giant whose influence reached from the Nile to the Indus. Persia's strength was not only its armies, but its ingenuity. Beneath its deserts and mountains lay a world of engineering wonders. The empire received little rain, yet its rulers found ways to make the earth bloom. Under Darius, the Persians created the Shushtar hydraulic system. A network of canals carved into the stone water from the Karun River was diverted to turn mills, feed orchards, and form man-made waterfalls that still flow today. It turned the desert into a garden. Even older was the Akhenaten system and underground canals that drew water from hidden aquifers deep underneath the earth. These tunnels, running for miles, carried cool, clear water to farmlands without losing a drop to the sun. Built with precise slopes, they required generations of labor and engineering genius. Vertical shafts, dug at intervals, marked their invisible path across the land, a pattern still visible from above like a dotted scar of civilization. The Khanats were nearly indestructible and untouched by war, flood, or time. They brought life to the empire long after the kings who ordered them had turned to dust. But Persia's greatness was not built on stone alone. It thrived on ideas, faith, and the human spirit. In cities like Persepolis and Susa, art, music, and science flourished. The Persians are said to have invented the kitar, ancestor of the guitar, and cherished the strategic dance of backgammon, one of the oldest surviving board games on Earth. Some even claim chess found its first move here, though its exact birthplace remains debated. In daily life, the empire reflected the diversity of its lands. From Egypt to Babylon, many customs blended into one. Slavery existed, but unlike in Greece or Rome, it was never the heart of Persian society. Most people lived free while bound by the laws of the king, and Persian women, by the standards of the ancient world, held remarkable freedom. They could own property, run businesses, travel freely, and even ride horses and shoot bows. These are privileges denied to women in many other cultures of the time. Only the throne itself remained closed to them. Among Persia's greatest legacies was its religion, Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster. His teachings, born perhaps in the 10th or 6th century BC, shaped the empire's moral soul. Zoroaster taught that the world was a battleground between good and evil, between the light of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of truth, and the darkness of his opposite. Yet unlike older beliefs, Zoroastrianism offered something radical: free will. Every person could choose their side in this eternal war. It spoke of heaven and hell, angels and demons, and a moral order known as Asher, meaning truth and righteousness. Fire became the symbol of divine purity, and so prayers were offered in the presence of flame or flowing water. Even Cyrus the Great had drawn inspiration from its principles, ruling not as a tyrant but as a guardian of law and balance. To this day, Zoroastrians continue to tend their sacred fires in small communities across Iran and India, living embers of a belief that once shaped the destiny of nations. For centuries after Xerxes, Persia remained a colossus, tolerant yet formidable, unshaken in its core ideals. Its kings ruled with absolute authority but sought stability over oppression. Rebellions were punished swiftly. Yet the empire allowed its conquered peoples to keep their gods, their languages, their ways of life. It was an empire built on law, order, and respect for diversity. Its vision was not of destruction, but of uniting the world beneath a single radiant order. But even the mightiest flame must someday flicker. What Cyrus and Darius built would one day face a conqueror unlike any the world had seen. A young man from the mountains of Macedonia who had read of Cyrus's deeds and dreamed of surpassing them all. His name was Alexander. The rise of Alexander. The Persian Empire that was once the greatest dominion on earth now faced a storm unlike any it had ever known. From the rugged hills of Macedonia, a young king was marching east, carrying not only the ambitions of Greece but the restless dreams of immortality, and the world would soon know him as the Great. In 334 BC, Alexander, only 22 years old, crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor with an army of around 50,000 men, a mix of hardened Macedonian veterans and ambitious Greek allies. He brought with him 6,000 cavalry, 38,000 infantry, and a small fleet. Against the massive Persian Empire, this force seemed almost laughably small, but Alexander possessed something Persia no longer did: unshakable will and the mind of a military genius. The first blow fell upon Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Its western lands were home to Greek cities long under Persian rule. As Alexander liberated each one, he presented himself as a deliverer, a young god coming to free his kin from eastern chains. His legend began to take shape here, and with every victory, the myth of his invincibility grew. In 333 BC, Alexander faced his first true test, the Battle of Issus. The Persian king Darius III, commanding an army at least twice the size of Alexander's, had finally come to meet the invader. The two forces clashed in a narrow coastal plain, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. The terrain, meant to trap the Greeks, became Darius's undoing. His countless men could not maneuver. Their numbers became a burden. At the height of battle, Alexander, leading his cavalry in person, charged straight toward Darius's royal chariot. The sight of the young king, spear raised and eyes fixed upon him, broke Darius's courage, and in that moment the King of Kings fled. Eventually the Persian lines collapsed. The greatest empire of the ancient world had been humbled, and by a foreign upstart not yet 30 years old. The cost of Darius's flight was more than pride. He left behind his wife, mother, and daughters, captured by Alexander along with the royal chariot, his bow, and the imperial mantle, the symbols of Persian sovereignty. To his credit, Alexander treated the royal women with respect, yet he refused to release them unless Darius acknowledged him as the rightful emperor of Persia. A demand the old king would never accept. The shock of that defeat shook the ancient world. For the first time in Persian history, a great king had fled the battlefield. Even Alexander himself stood in disbelief at how easily the empire of Cyrus and Darius was weak before him. In 332 BC, he reached the Phoenician city of Tyre, an island fortress famed for its defiance and wealth. When Tyre refused to surrender, Alexander swore that he would take it no matter the cost. For 7 long months, his engineers built a massive causeway across the sea, linking the island to the mainland. The battle that followed was merciless. When Tyre finally fell, Alexander unleashed his wrath. The men were slaughtered. The women and children were sold into slavery. The once great city was reduced to ashes. Soon after, Gaza resisted him as well and suffered the same fate in the assault. Alexander himself was wounded, an arrow piercing his shoulder. Yet his resolve only hardened. These brutal examples made his message clear: surrender and live under his protection, or resist and face annihilation. When Alexander reached Egypt, the reaction was the opposite. The Egyptians, weary of Persian rule, welcomed him as a liberator. In 331 BC, he was crowned pharaoh, declared the son of the god Amun. On the windswept delta, he founded a new city known as Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest centers of learning and trade in human history. Its lighthouse, its libraries, its scholars, all would trace their birth to this moment of conquest and creation. But Alexander's journey was far from over. His eyes turned once again east toward the center of Persia. That same year, Darius rallied another massive army. At Gaugamela, in the plains of modern-day Iraq, he gathered warriors from every corner of his empire of Persians, Medes, Bactrians, and Indians, men who still believed in the divine strength of their king. The ground was cleared and flattened to favor his chariots. The terrain itself was chosen to ensure victory. Yet even here, Darius faltered. Once again, Alexander struck with his cavalry, slicing through the Persian left flank before charging straight for the royal center. And once again, Darius turned and fled his army, seeing their god-king abandon them, dissolved into chaos. It was the death knell of the Persian Empire. From Babylon to Persepolis, the cities of Persia fell one by one, often opening their gates willingly. They had seen what resistance meant, and they had seen how Alexander spared those who yielded. His mix of ruthless punishment and mercy turned fear into loyalty faster than any sword could. Darius, wounded and betrayed, was later murdered by one of his own satraps. When Alexander found his body, he wept, ordering royal honors for the fallen king. Then, as a final act of symbolism, he married Roxana, Darius's daughter, binding himself by blood to the lineage of the Achaemenids. Persia, at last, had fallen, and its conqueror now wore its crown. In 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis, the jewel of the Persian kings. For days, the Greeks plundered its palaces with gold, silk, ivory, and jewels beyond imagining. Then, during a night of drinking, a fire broke out. Whether born of revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens or of drunken accident, the flames consumed the heart of the empire. The grand halls of Darius and Xerxes burned until dawn. When Alexander awoke and saw the destruction, he was devastated. The conqueror who sought to become Persian had destroyed Persia's soul. Even after his victory, Alexander could not stop marching. He hunted the last pretenders to Darius's throne across Central Asia, through deserts and mountains, what is now Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan. Each victory brought him further from home and deeper into obsession. By 326 BC, he crossed the Indus River into India, seeking new worlds to conquer. His armies followed him into monsoon rains and strange jungles. They won again and again, but at last they refused to go farther. For the first time, Alexander relented. He turned back by the will of his own men. In Susa, the old Elamite capital, Alexander tried to unite Greek and Persian. He adopted Persian dress, customs, and even court rituals, which angered many of his Macedonian officers. At a drunken feast, he quarreled with his friend Clytus, the man who had once saved his life in battle. In rage and intoxication, Alexander killed him with his own spear. The guilt haunted him. It was as if the more he tried to become a Persian emperor, the further he drifted from the man he once was. In a grand gesture of unity, he arranged mass marriages between his Greek officers and Persian noblewomen, including his own marriage to Roxana. Yet few of these unions lasted beyond his death in 323 BC. At the age of just 32, Alexander fell ill in Babylon. Some said poison, others said fever. Many believed it was exhaustion. The body of a man who had burned too brightly for too long. When asked who should inherit his empire, he claimed it should be the strongest. And with that, the greatest conqueror of the ancient world was gone. His empire, stretching from Greece to India, fractured almost immediately. His generals tore it apart in a struggle for power. 4 kingdoms emerged: Macedonia and Greece, the Seleucid Empire in Persia and Mesopotamia, Egypt under Ptolemy, and Thrace and Anatolia in the west. This new era would be called the Hellenistic Age, a time when Greek language and culture blended with the wisdom of the East. In Egypt, Ptolemy founded a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, met her tragic end in 30 BC in Central Asia. Greek influence fused with Buddhism, creating Greco-Buddhism, from which the teachings of the Buddha would travel eastward into China. And though the Persian Empire had fallen, its spirit remained in the languages, the architecture, the governance, and even the religions that followed. The Persian Empire began with a dream, a vision of unity under justice. It ended with another dreamer of a man who sought to rule not just a nation, but the world itself. From Cyrus to Alexander, the torch of empire passed, and in its light, the ancient world was forever changed. From the ashes of empire. The Persian Empire had fallen to Alexander's sword, yet the story of Persia did not end in the smoke of Persepolis. Like the phoenix rising from its own ashes, new powers would emerge from the same mountains and plains: nomads, nobles, prophets, and conquerors. Each would claim the legacy of Cyrus, each would add a new verse to the eternal Persian saga. In the massive meadow of modern-day Turkmenistan, beyond the reach of cities and kings, lived a hardy nomadic people known as the Parthians. They were children of the wind, horsemen of the plains, descended from the same Indo-Iranian tribes that had once birthed the Medes and Persians themselves. For decades after Alexander's death, they lived under the rule of his successors, the Seleucid Empire, the Greek kingdom that had inherited Persia's heartlands. Greek satraps, governors of foreign blood, ruled over the lands once blessed by Zoroaster. But the Parthians were restless. The flame of independence still burned deep in their nomadic hearts. Then there was Mithridates the Great, the man who would change everything. Around 155 BC, Mithridates waged war in the east, striking against the Greco-Bactrians and reclaiming the lands that once belonged to the ancient Persian kings. His armies moved fast, unpredictable, and unstoppable. He then turned west, pressing into lands now under Greco-Roman influence. The Parthians, once wanderers, had become conquerors. A new empire rose upon the bones of the old, the Parthian Empire, stretching from the Indus Valley to the Euphrates, from the mountains of Iran to the deserts of Arabia, and with it the great Persian pattern returned to a center of power rising from the Iranian plateau, expanding east toward India and west toward the Levant and Anatolia. Each age of Persia had lived this rhythm, strong rulers bringing growth, weak ones losing ground, and new nomadic forces waiting beyond the horizon to inherit the empire's remains. Under the Parthians, the fusion of Greek and Iranian cultures reached its zenith. The art, architecture, and faith of the East blended with the philosophy and discipline of the West. One symbol of this synthesis was the cult of Mithra, the ancient Iranian god of light and truth, reborn under Greek influence. Centuries later, Roman soldiers stationed far from home would worship a new form of this deity known as Mithra. These rites, inspired by Persian Mithraism, were layered with symbols of astrology, initiation, and divine struggle, a mystical brotherhood within the Roman army. It would one day rival Christianity itself before fading into history's shadows. The ancient spirit of Persia, it seemed, had found new life, even in the center of Rome. Unlike the rigid monarchies of their predecessors, the Parthians ruled through a delicate balance of power. Their government was aristocratic rather than autocratic. The nobility held the right to choose and depose their kings. If a ruler grew unfit or unjust, he could be removed by a vote of nobles, and likewise, a noble could be stripped of power by the king, provided the decision was deemed fair. This strange balance created something rare in the ancient world: political stability. Rome's expansion eastward soon met a wall known as the Parthian Empire. What followed was not a single war, but a rivalry that lasted centuries. Parthian horse archers, masters of speed and deception, would devastate the legions of Rome with tactics never seen before. Their most famous maneuver was a deadly trick. A mounted archer, pretending to flee, would twist backward in full gallop and loose arrows at his pursuers with uncanny accuracy. In 53 BC, this tactic reached legendary status at the Battle of Carrhae. There, the Parthians annihilated the army of Marcus Crassus, Rome's wealthiest man and a member of the First Triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey. Captured after his defeat, Crassus met a gruesome end of molten gold poured down his throat. A fitting punishment for the man whose greed had driven him into the desert. Rome would never forget it. And Parthia, once dismissed as barbaric, was now seen as the equal of Rome, a mirror empire in the east. By the 3rd century AD, Parthian rule began to wane. Their nobility, once a source of balance, had become ambitious. From this instability rose a new dynasty, one that looked back not to the Greeks but to Cyrus, Darius, and the ancient Achaemenids. Their founder, Ardashir I, came from the region of Persis, the homeland of Cyrus the Great. In 224 AD, he overthrew the last Parthian king and forged a new order, the Sasanian Empire. With the Sasanians, Persia returned to its roots. Zoroastrianism became the state religion, the sacred fire once again burning in temples across the land. Greek influences remained, but the heart of Iran beat proudly to its own rhythm once more. The Sasanians' centralized power built massive cities and re-established Persia as a civilizational powerhouse and a rival to the rising Christian Byzantine Empire in the west. For 4 centuries, these two superpowers would clash across deserts and mountains, each claiming to be the rightful heir of the ancient world. Under the Sasanians, Persia flourished. The empire became a beacon of art, philosophy, and science. The Silk Road thrived, carrying silk, gold, and ideas between east and west. Persian merchants traded with India and China, while musicians and dancers traveled in both directions. Even as far as the Mediterranean, signs of Sasanian influence could be seen in architecture, textiles, and court ceremonies. Many of the cultural achievements that later generations would call Islamic in art, literature, and engineering were in truth Persian in origin. It was during this age that the mysterious Baghdad battery was made using a clay pot with a metal core, capable of producing a small electric charge. Its purpose remains unknown, but its very existence shows the ingenuity of Sasanian science. Meanwhile, new religions emerged. Among them was Manichaeism, founded by the prophet Mani, a faith that sought to unite the teachings of Zoroaster, Jesus, and the Buddha into one final revelation. It spread swiftly, from Persia to Rome to China, only to be crushed by the very empires it wanted to enlighten. But even mighty empires are not eternal. By the 7th century AD, the Sasanians and Byzantines had exhausted each other in a long, bitter war. The empire was weakened and drained of gold, soldiers, and faith. A terrible plague swept through the land, and civil war erupted after the death of King Khosrow II. Then, from the south, a new force emerged as a tide that would reshape the world, the Arab Muslims. In 636 AD, at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, the Sasanian army was crushed within a decade. The great Persian Empire had fallen. Its sacred fires were extinguished, its priests scattered, its holy texts burned. Many Persians resisted as governors were assassinated, but wave after wave of Arab reinforcements came in. Eventually, Persia submitted. Zoroastrians who refused to convert were forced to pay a heavy tax, the jizya, or flee. Some escaped east, finding refuge in India, where their descendants, the Parsis, still keep the ancient fire alive today. By the late Middle Ages, Islam had become the dominant faith of Iran, but the conversion was one of transformation. The Persians, though conquered, reshaped Islam itself. Persian thinkers, poets, and scholars would help define Islamic civilization for centuries to come. The Umayyad Caliphate, which ruled from Spain to Central Asia, adopted Persian systems of administration and court etiquette. Persian culture and language became central to the Islamic world, influencing everything from governance to literature. And though the empires changed from the Umayyads to the Abbasids, from the Turks to the Ottomans, the Persian spirit continued. It had survived the Medes, the Greeks, the Parthians, the Romans, and now the Arabs. Because Persia was never just an empire, it was a civilization. From faith to empire, empires fall, kings vanish, and yet the Persian flame kept burning. But this time the fire would burn beneath a new banner, the crescent of Islam, and as Persia rose once more under the shadow of a new faith, it would find itself divided by belief. When the Prophet Muhammad passed away in 632 AD, the world he had unified trembled. Who would lead the faithful now? Some believed that Muhammad had chosen Ali, his cousin and son-in-law, as his rightful successor. These believers became the Shia, meaning the followers of Ali. Others, however, argued that no such appointment had been made and the leader of Islam should be chosen by the community itself. They elected Abu Bakr, Muhammad's trusted companion, as the first caliph. These became the Sunni Muslims. What began as a dispute over leadership soon turned into a wound that would never fully heal across the centuries. That single question, who was the rightful heir of Muhammad, would ignite wars, divide empires, and shape entire civilizations. Over time, this political divide deepened into theological and cultural ones. Shia and Sunni scholars began to interpret scripture differently, building distinct traditions, rituals, and views of the world. In the early centuries, Shia Islam found its strongholds in Egypt and North Africa, but eventually it would find its eternal home in Iran today. Iran stands as the leader of the Shia world, often in quiet opposition to the Sunni-majority nations that surround it. The sign of that ancient division is still seen through the world as a reminder that the empire of faith, like all empires before it, is built not only on power but on belief. After the first great Islamic dynasty, known as the Umayyads, rose to power, their empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Indus. But within their triumph, discontent simmered. Non-Arab Muslims, including Persians, felt like second-class citizens under Arab rule. Then there was the Abbasids, a dynasty born from revolution, rebellion, and Persian influence. Their rise was aided by an Iranian general, and their rule marked a turning point. The old Persian administrative systems, artistry, and intellect began to flow back into the heart of Islamic governance. In 762 AD, the Abbasids built their capital, Baghdad, the city of peace. It was built upon the fertile soil near ancient Babylon. It was not just a city, it was a civilization reborn here. The Abbasids built the world's first paper mill, adapting the art of papermaking learned from China. Knowledge became currency. Ideas flowed like rivers through Baghdad's markets, libraries, and academies. It was in this golden city that Persian, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian texts were translated, preserved, and studied. Under the Abbasids, the world remembered itself. Under the Abbasids, the empire became a crucible of intellect. Astronomers charted the heavens, physicians dissected disease, mathematicians invented algebra, chemists experimented with acids and metals, and philosophers debated existence itself. The great scholar Alhazen explored the laws of optics, laying the foundation of modern physics. In distant laboratories, alchemists experimented with numbers and formulas that would one day lead to calculus. This age did not belong to one person alone. It was a mosaic. Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, and Persians worked side by side. Though often barred from political power, their minds built the foundations of the modern world. From Baghdad, ideas spread westward, bringing with them inventions like the astrolabe, the concept of zero, and gunpowder. But the Golden Age was not only about science. It was in this era that the legendary 1001 Nights took shape, a collection born from Persian, Indian, Arabic, and Egyptian tales. Within its pages lived Sinbad the Sailor, Ali Baba, and Aladdin, timeless symbols of wonder and wit that still enchant the world today. Baghdad was now the crossroads of East and West. As the Abbasid Empire expanded, it grew unwieldy. Provinces broke away into Morocco, Egypt, North Africa. Each slipping from the caliph's grasp, and from the cold meadow of Central Asia, new horsemen appeared as the Seljuk Turks. They were fierce, disciplined, and hungry for glory. Like so many before them, these nomads replaced the old dynasty, continuing the Persian cycle, each empire reborn from the ashes of the one before it. But then there was a storm unlike any the world had seen. In the 13th century, the Mongols moved across the horizon. They razed cities, slaughtered millions, and left smoking deserts where gardens once bloomed. In 1258, they reached Baghdad, and for 7 days and nights, the city burned. Its libraries were thrown into the Tigris, turning its waters black with ink. The destruction of Baghdad was more than the fall of a city. It was the death of an age and the end of the Islamic Golden Era. Without its scholars and its infrastructure, Persia's fertile lands turned to dust. Entire cities vanished. The ancient khanats, the underground irrigation systems that sustained agriculture for millennia, were destroyed, and with them the lifeblood of civilization. In time, the Mongol conquerors settled and converted to Islam, favoring the mystical and poetic teachings of Sufism. For a brief moment, Persia began to heal. Trade resumed, cities were rebuilt, scholars returned, but peace would not last. In 1381, a new terror moved across the land, Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane. A warrior scarred by arrow wounds, limping but unbroken, Timur set out to rule the world through blood and fire. He demanded unconditional surrender. Those who refused were slaughtered without mercy. By the time his campaigns ended, as many as 17 million people lay dead. This was about 5% of the world's population. To his followers, he was a conqueror blessed by heaven. But to his victims, he was the horseman of the apocalypse. Yet paradoxically, amid his conquests, Timur became a patron of art and architecture. His empire, however, would not outlive him by a century. For centuries, Persia had been a broken mosaic, conquered by Mongols, divided by Turks, drained by war. But from this chaos emerged a new light, the Safavid dynasty. Its founder, Shah Ismail I, was no ordinary ruler. He was a poet, a warrior, and a spiritual leader who descended from Turkoman, Kurdish, Greek, and Georgian bloodlines, perfectly embodying the mixed heritage of the Persian plateau. In the early 1500s, Ismail united the lands of Iran, the Caucasus, Turkmenistan, and parts of Mesopotamia under one banner, reviving the Persian Empire's ancient borders. And he made a bold decision that would define Iran forever. He declared Shia Islam the state religion. The fusion of Persian mysticism, Sufi spirituality, and Shia theology created a unique faith. Distinct from the Sunni traditions of the Arab world under Shah Abbas the Great, the Safavid Empire flourished. Allied with European powers like the Dutch and the Austrians, Abbas modernized his army under the guidance of English officers such as Sir Robert Shirley with the help of the British Navy. He expelled the Portuguese from the Persian Gulf, reclaiming Hormuz and Bahrain. Trade boomed, and now Persian carpets, silk and metalwork became prized across Europe. But even as Persian culture reached new heights, the empire began to stagnate. While Europe entered the scientific revolution, Persia stood still, content in its golden past. The successors of Abbas were weak, lost in wine and pleasure, blind to the storms gathering beyond their borders. To the north, Russia was hungry, relentless, and expanding. Now the ancient game of empires was about to begin again. The destroyed crown of Persia. The winds of the Caucasus howled cold over a broken empire. By the early 18th century, Persia was now but a shadow of its past glory. Under Peter the Great, the Russian Empire swept south like a rising tide, conquering Persia's Caucasian provinces in 1723. These were lands that had once been proud Persian heartlands, now fallen to foreign banners. In the east, the frontiers trembled once more. The rugged lands of Afghanistan and Pakistan, long restless under Persian control, rose in rebellion to the west. The Ottoman Empire, ever watchful for weakness, seized its chance and carved away parts of western Iran. The Persian world, once stretching from the Indus to the Aegean, was bleeding from every border in 1724. The Treaty of Constantinople divided what was left of Iran between the Russians and Ottomans. An empire that had once ruled the known world was now being partitioned by its rivals, its fate decided in foreign courts. But Persia, wounded as it was, still carried the spirit of resurrection. From the chaos of rebellion, a soldier named Nader Shah became the architect of Persia's revival. By 1735, Nader had done the impossible. Through cunning diplomacy and sheer force of will, he restored Persia's independence. The foreign armies that had divided his homeland were driven out, yet Nader was not content with defense. He hungered for conquest. He turned his gaze eastward toward the fabled riches of India. In a campaign that stunned the world, his armies crossed deserts and mountains to strike at Delhi itself. The once mighty Mughal Empire trembled before him. When his troops entered the Indian capital, they carried away a fortune. Among the spoils were the legendary Peacock Throne and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. The wealth of Delhi flowed into Persia like a river of gold, fueling Nader's dream to rebuild his nation's might and reclaim lands long lost to the Ottomans. But as his empire grew, so did his paranoia. The same brilliance that had made him a savior now twisted into cruelty. Distrust consumed him, betrayal became an obsession, friends became enemies, allies became threats. In 1747, Nader Shah was assassinated and struck down by his own men. When the dust settled, Persia's borders once again stretched over the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and parts of Anatolia. Yet the hand that had restored the empire was gone, and chaos rushed in to fill the void. After Nader's death, Persia descended into decades of civil war and anarchy. Tribes, warlords, and nobles all sought to claim the shattered throne. The sound of steel and the cries of battle once again echoed across the ancient land. Out of this darkness rose Agha Muhammad Khan, a man as cold and calculating as the mountains he came from. In 1796, he crushed his rivals and founded the Qajar dynasty, binding Persia under a single banner once more. His ambition was clear: to reclaim Persia's lost glory, especially in the Caucasus, where Russian expansion loomed like a gathering storm. But the world had changed. The industrial powers of Europe now held technologies and armies far beyond anything the East had ever seen. Persia, proud but unindustrialized, struggled to maintain independence against the Russian Empire to the north and the British Empire to the south. Two devastating wars like the Russo-Persian Wars of 1804 to 1813 and 1826 to 1828 ended with the loss of Persia's northern provinces. Even though Russia was embroiled in its own war against Napoleon, its power proved overwhelming. The treaties that followed cut deep, ceding centuries-old Persian lands, a wound that would never fully heal. At this point, foreign powers began pulling Persia's strings like puppeteers. Russia and Britain, rivals in the global great game for control of Central Asia, contend for dominance over the Persian court. Persia became a pawn between empires. Its rulers tried to play one power against the other, but in the process lost even more sovereignty. By the early 20th century, internal corruption deepened, fueled by foreign money and oil concessions. The discovery of oil in 1908 promised wealth, yet it became a curse, enriching outsiders and a handful of elites while leaving the nation poor and divided. In 1905, the people rose. A wave of revolutions between 1905 and 1911 shook the country, demanding reform and constitutional government. The monarchy weakened, but so too did the nation's unity. In 1907, the Anglo-Russian Convention divided Iran into two zones of influence, slicing the country into northern and southern halves. Without even consulting its people, Persia, the empire that once ruled from Greece to India, was now carved up on a European map table. Amid this humiliation, one man seized the moment: Reza Khan, a military officer of ambition and vision. With British support, he overthrew the weakened Qajar dynasty in 1921 and crowned himself Reza Shah Pahlavi. Under his rule, Persia was reborn again, renamed Iran, meaning land of the Aryans, a tribute to its ancient heritage. He modernized the army, built railways, expanded education, and sought to drag the nation into the modern age. But modernization came at a price. Reza Shah ruled with an iron fist. His nationalism was fierce, his secularism absolute. Religion was pushed aside, dissent crushed, and the people silenced in the name of progress. Western clothing replaced traditional garments, women were encouraged to unveil, and Islamic influence in governance was sharply reduced. To many Iranians, these reforms felt less like renewal and more like betrayal. By the outbreak of World War II, Iran stood at a crossroads. When Reza Shah showed sympathy for Germany, the British and Soviet armies invaded in 1941. Occupying the country to secure vital oil and transport routes, Iran became a lifeline for the Allies, the Persian corridor through which American weapons flowed to the Soviet front. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. His son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, ascended the throne. In the post-war years, Iran was torn between democracy and monarchy, nationalism and foreign control. The young Shah shared power uneasily with Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a patriot who dared to challenge the West in 1951. Mossadegh nationalized Iran's oil, striking directly at British interests. London retaliated with blockades, and soon the C-1A and M-16 conspired to overthrow him in 1953. A coup d'état of Operation Ajax toppled Mossadegh, restoring full power to the Shah. From 1953 to 1973, Western oil companies dominated Iran's vast reserves. The Shah used the wealth to build highways, skyscrapers, and one of the strongest armies in the region. In 1973, amid the global oil crisis, the Shah seized back control of Iranian oil and launched an ambitious modernization drive. Yet the gap between rich and poor widened, corruption deepened, and religious opposition grew. Then in 1979 it happened. The streets filled with chants, the mosques overflowed with defiance, and the Islamic Revolution swept through the nation. The Shah fled. Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile. The monarchy fell, and the Islamic Republic of Iran was born. What had once been an empire of kings was now a theocracy born from revolution. The revolution turned the world upside down. Western diplomats were taken hostage, communist allies were purged, and Iran stood isolated. When Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, invaded in 1980, the West backed Baghdad. The war lasted 8 brutal years with trench warfare, chemical weapons, and cities reduced to rubble. But Iran endured. In the decades that followed, Iran found new allies in China and Russia, and joined emerging powers in organizations like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Even under sanctions, it projected influence across the Middle East, reviving the stories of the old Persian sphere. Above all, empires have come and gone. Today, Iran stands as the modern heir of that ancient legacy. And so, the story continues. The empire of Cyrus the Great may have fallen long ago, but its realities still stretch across time.